get into this again. Mario Nawfal, sorry if I pronounced that wrong. First time I've come across Professor Richard Werner, and I just had to, this is really important, and I'm just jumping into it at this point, but he was talking about what had happened during the First and Second World War and how, in his opinion, he thinks we could be headed for World War III.
Equipment, troops, weapons. So, and of course, quite naturally, then the cooperation would increase. And there was even the possibility that, Russia could also warm up. I mean, there have been hostilities between Ottoman Empire and Russia, of course. There have been some rivalry between Germany and Russia and so on. But, once you have this dynamic with this railway line, the logistics has an important economic impact, and that has an important political and, strategic military impact. And that's really what the main consideration was. So now, fast forward to the present. And of course, at the moment, we're seeing sort of the reverse of good trade flows. We're seeing a disruption via the oceans of trade flows because there are choke points and there are powers that are intervening and cutting some countries potentially off, or threatening to cut some countries off, and which could have a serious and will have a serious negative impact. For example, if the blockade of the blockade, which is what the Trump administration had been imposing, continues, we're now, it's lasted now so long, much longer than people had thought. There are already going to be negative consequences now. There's energy, but there's also there's fertilizer. There's many other ramifications. Now, why is the U.S. doing this? And as you pointed out, I mean, this has been a U.S. decision. There's no doubt, which is slightly unusual because often these things are much more obscure. They're obscured on purpose. If you, for example, have a false flag and then, oh, it's the bad Iranians who are starting it and so on. Of course, this is what they tried to do also with the First World War, Second World War, a lot of, Vietnam War, other wars, certainly wars where America was involved. There's a lot of false flags. And so you don't really see so obviously what's happening. In this case, there's no doubt this was started by America, potentially, America/Israel. But since, in terms of foreign policy, they've been almost one for quite a long time, for decades. That's perhaps only a minor distinction. And so why are they doing this now? Well, so my contention is that it's really the same development that we've seen in this run-up to the First World War. So it became clear around 1900 that this is going to happen. They watched it for a decade and a few years, but then it was really clear they wanted the ultimate disruption of this Berlin, Baghdad, Basra railway, and that is war on Germany and destruction of Imperial Germany, destruction of Austria-Hungary, destruction of the Ottoman Empire, which was achieved, of course, with the First World War. And of course, the railway was not built. Many components became part of the British sphere of influence. Britain then controlled a lot in the Middle East, drew the borders, created Iraq, and all sorts of many countries, of course, with the borders drawn in London. So, likewise, currently, the main consideration is that very similar to Germany and the Berlin-Baghdad Basra Railway, China has been working on this Belt and Road Initiative. Now, Belt and Road sounds kind of obscure, and many people have heard it because it's actually the flagship foreign policy, and even you could say foreign and domestic initiative, the flagship initiative of the current president Xi Jinping.
Just quickly there, I've heard that mentioned, and I did know what it was describing, the Belt and Road Initiative. But look at America. When USAID give all that money to build roads in Afghanistan. You get all the people on the left and all the do-gooders. Oh, well, look what America are doing for the people of Afghanistan. It's like, no, they were building roads to make it easier for the Pakistani ISI and the CIA to get weapons and armoured vehicles to the freedom fighters. They both do it like they both do it.
It was announced now almost 11 years ago, and that's when it started. So timing is also similar to what happened, before the First World War. It takes a decade for these things to pan out, and the other side to start to feel, okay, we need to move towards action now. But the parallels are quite clear. What is this Belt and Road Initiative? It is essentially a multifaceted Berlin-Baghdad railway of the modern day, where China builds very concrete and pragmatic trade corridors and the infrastructure for very effective, cheap, and fast trade with a number of key countries, and you could even say with continents, connecting China and making it independent from the sea routes, which of course are currently under US control and US dominance. And that, the US has strong presence in the Pacific, just right outside China, but obviously also in the Middle East, the Gulf area, as we see currently. But if China had the land part of the Belt and Road Initiative sorted, which is building railways, building high-speed motorways, building transport routes on the railways. There's the latest container logistic, multi-mode transportation combinations being implemented, and China building infrastructure, bridges, amazing bridges, as you will have seen some of the more stunning ones, both in China and in the remote Western areas, connecting to the rest of of Central Asia and the rest of the world, and also in other countries. And they've been doing this now for more than a decade. Many countries have been very happy to join because, this is a form of development aid. And China, unlike the World Bank and the IMF, has not given them this long list of conditionality. We'll give you money, we'll help you, we'll support you, we'll help you with infrastructure, but you have to do X, Y, Z, including maybe changes in your political system, in your constitution. You have to allow foreigners to buy your land, and many countries didn't want that interference of the IMF and the World Bank. And if we have time, we should a little bit talk about that IMF World Bank system, because it's been quite dreadful for developing countries. It's really achieved the opposite of what it said it would achieve. So many countries were quite open to China making overtures and offering finance and helping build this wonderful infrastructure, amazing highways and bridges and roads and ports, of course, and all connected to the logistics of good international trade, where, of course, China was setting a kind of priority list. And clearly, countries that have resources that would fit into the Chinese sort of supply chain were higher up the list. And so clearly, it served that purpose. The Belt and Road Initiative has many aspects. So there are, we talk about the land connections, which is essentially a modern Silk Road. And it's not just one, there's many parallel, land routes in different forms, including railway, of course, but also others. And then there's even a sea route as well. China has also been building a navy that is getting larger and larger. And so on all these levels, the more, shall we say, sort of imperial thinkers, the neocons in America, that have been thinking about America as some kind of empire that has this great task and responsibility to sort out the world and maintain its hegemony and dominance. Those thinkers, of course, have been identifying this for a long time as a major threat that needs to be stopped. Now, Venezuela was already the first step in this disruption because we know Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, but the oil is a very specific oil. As you know, it's a kind of heavy crude oil that needs a particular type of refineries, but China had built those refineries, and the input from Venezuela was an important part in the energy supply chain in China. So this has been a disruption, and to me indicates that that was the beginning of this quite pointed strategic policy now to tackle China.
But again, Trump just went and kidnapped Maduro and took the oil, bragged about it. And China, at the moment, haven't done anything. And then people get all mad. Well, China are giving intelligence. China are sending aid to Iran. What would America do if it was reversed, like? Why can't we all just get on this? Is madness, like? And it's ominous and it's scary because something big is coming, believe me.
In its international attempts to maintain very stable raw material supplies. And of course, Venezuela, from a Chinese perspective, is a case in point. That's all via ship. The Navy, the American Navy is dominant, certainly around Venezuela, and we've seen also the intervention and the lengths that the Trump administration is willing to go in intervening quite visibly and dramatically and changing the flows of oil. And so now with Iran, that's the next step, because of course Iran was another major and has been a major supplier of oil to China. And there is still a land route, of course. So even if this blockade continues and the blockade of the blockade continues, well, China has been working on completing a land route to Iran. And what we saw in this in these bombing campaigns of Iran is those were included. You know, some of the key bridges that have been built were included in this bombing campaign in Iran. So that's when I thought, okay, this really fits the picture. That's not a coincidence. The real target seems to be China and its Belt and Road Initiative.
Were they bombed in the early days of the war?
Not in the first few days, I think. And I think that was for strategic consideration, because that makes it too obvious. So it was when it then, another bombing raid, and then it was part of these secondary, tertiary bombing raids.
So the comparison being made here is before World War I, you had the British Empire and Germany became threat, building that land corridor with the Ottoman Empire. And that was seen as a threat to the UK, to the British hegemony.
Sorry for interrupting again. A threat to what? Why can't everyone just make money? Look at China. Who, like America? Oh, China, and the same as us in the UK. Russia. They're poking the bear. They are poking the bear. And we live quite peacefully, quite happily, quite luxurious in the West. You know who to blame when it comes knocking at your door. Sorry, I'll let this play out.
Money. And the UK, let's say, directly retaliated, but kind of the escalation began there and led eventually to World War I, where one spark led to a global conflict. And we're seeing a kind of a repeat of this in the sense that the US is kind of taking the place of the British Empire after World War II. And China's in a way, it's not in a way, it is the rising power right now, the same way Germany was many decades ago before World War I. And the replacement of the corridor between the Ottoman Empire and the the Ottoman Empire and Germany, that land corridor is kind of the equivalent now is the Belt and Road Initiative by China, the land and sea corridors across the world. So that is seen as a threat to US hegemony. And therefore, and by the way, I've been talking about this since the early days of the war, is that because that's the only thing that makes sense to me. Not in as much detail as you. I didn't make the comparison to World War I, but I've always said that the only logical reason for this war is controlling the Strait of Hormuz. because the other explanations just don't make sense for such a drastic war. And there's a gentleman that's a regular on the show. His name is Jeffrey Snyder. He has a YouTube account called Eurasia. So he talks about the Eurodollar. It's called Eurodollar Group, I think, or something. And he's got a similar belief as me. And he concluded what you said in the sense, and what worries me is that if this is the main reason, then the war is not over. Then continuing the war makes more sense strategically. Because if the reason was anything else, ending the war makes the most logical sense. But if the reason is something so important for U.S. security and U.S. hegemony, to have that leverage over China the same way China has rare earth leverage, then yes, the war is not over. And you took it a step further and said this could be the beginning of what could become a global war, or what you called, or what some people call World War III. Now, why do you think it has to get to that level?
Yes. Well, so first of all, it's because the real motivation is something else. It is not just the technicality of, we need some, international atomic inspections starting their work again. Well, they were there before, and there was an agreement with the Biden administration. So, it's the whole nuclear story doesn't really make all that much sense. And then the blockade, again, as you said, the blockade, why would America risk this disruption of global trade flows when it had other goals? But then also the fact that, well, what is the goal? And really no leading figure of the Trump administration has been able to give a proper and consistent rationale of what's been happening. We even had, the Secretary of State Rubio saying that, well, it's just Israel told us to do this, which is a little bit, laughable in the sense that it's such a major operation. And even if you grant that, okay, Israel has a key influence over U.S. foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East, right? To just, okay, Israel now said, let's do it. That's kind of hard to believe that this is exactly how it works. Because the strategic thinkers, not only in the US behind the scenes, also in Israel, and of course in London, in the city of London. And so we have to go to this level. What are the strategic considerations, the bigger considerations? And this is especially true because it's such a dangerous war to start. As you said, a highly risky war. Because of course, Iran has allies. It's not an alliance like NATO where you have a treaty, and if Iran is attacked, the treaty conditions are being met, and immediately, America is at war with Russia or China. It's not like that, but Iran has been allied in many ways and has been quite closely cooperating with Russia and with China, and is a part of the BRICS initiative, is part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. These are all parts of this Belt and Road Initiative, which has many facets. And of course, it is a strategic supplier of oil to China. Therefore, you can't, even without knowing anything about this background and the history, you can't ignore China. Now, if Iran gets pushed further and further, then of course, Russia and China will have to consider what are they going to do. Also, of course, important to understand what could happen next is, and what the real risks are, how much have they been involved so far? What we do know is that the targeting of Iranian rockets and missiles has been extremely precise. Has been so precise that essentially the military bases in the Gulf of the US, and there's been many of them surrounding Iran all across, the Gulf, surrounding Iran from all sides, up to Iraq, of course, and so on. Most of them have been deserted now. Not only that, the CIA offices and bases, which are not officially known, they're not publicized, they've been hit so precisely in a particular building on the 4th floor, wham, right in there into the CIA office, gone. That also all, it seems, as I heard from well-informed sources, all the CIA officers in the stations, they call them, the CIA stations, have also been deserted, abandoned. And now, how's that possible? That's, of course, where one has to conclude, well, they had help. They had a lot of good, very precise information about these locations on the one hand, and secondly, the missile technology was clearly very advanced to be so precise, so specific, and so effective. It had to go, through all their, defense shields and counter missile measures and batteries and so on, missile defense systems. So that is a high bar, quite clearly, and everyone was surprised by how effective they were, breaking through there and then being so specifically targeting these locations, the US bases and CIA stations, that really one has to conclude, okay, Russia had in the Ukraine-Russia war said when it was clear that British long-range missiles were used against Russia, and other long-range missiles were used, where essentially other NATO countries, particularly Britain and America, were helping the Ukrainians with the coordination and the technology, the targeting. Apparently, really, it can't be done by Ukrainians. It had to be these missile specialists who would be, say, British and American. And Russia had commented on that and had essentially said, we will reserve our right to respond in kind at a time and place of our choosing. And I think that's what we witnessed. So essentially, Russia has likely helped, clearly with the, they have got very good information about CIA stations and US military bases, but then also China. Now with China, we just know less how good their information gathering is, and probably is also very, very good. And of course, China is more important probably in terms of delivering components and delivering technology and weapons technology and weapons support. But I think, one has to conclude, okay, well, Russia and China have been helping Iran. And so that's, of course, why we are at this, in the run-up to what could be World War III if America keeps pushing. Now, America, one has to see, has realized that. Of course, they know what we've been saying. I think, okay, Russia and China is involved. So that should be a point for the US to reconsider its steps and turn this into something else if they don't want World War III. That's what we need to see. And I hope, they will come up with a way to change their course. But if they keep, moving in this direction, then that is all there is, because the resistance is going to be firm, and Russia and China will likely decide to keep backing Iran. So an escalation is likely. We've seen already in the Ukraine battlefield that, it took time. It took a few years, but we see more and more involvement of NATO countries, and NATO initially was just advisors, but really it's more like NATO troops, NATO weapons, NATO coordination of missiles into Russia. Some would say we've actually crossed the line already, just recently in the last month, with these missiles into Russia, essentially, with involvement of British American military people, quite directly involved, likely. Certainly Russia could see it that way. So we've seen the escalation in Ukraine, and so one could avoid further escalation in the Gulf area. But is that happening? So far, it's a very mixed bag. There's lots of talk about negotiations, but as you've seen, the negotiators do get killed quite frequently. American action seems to take place and Israeli action during negotiations, during ceasefires. So it's not really the type of wholehearted attempt to solve this diplomatically and peacefully. And that
we'll leave it there. And they are worrying times. Just remember, when this does come to our doors, which it's going to, unfortunately, well, it already is with the price of fuel. You know, just speaking for myself, it's putting an extra £30 a week on my diesel bill. And some people in America are thinking, oh, well, the higher gas prices are worth it to get rid of the state sponsor of terrorism. Please do some research, please. Follow Mario. He has the best guests on, him and Daniel Davis. But this is a must watch. People need to know the context and where this is heading.